Innovation and Diffusion podcast. I'm Rivera Gozan, and today we have a very special guest, Walker Hanlon. Welcome, Walker. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for accepting our invitation. Just to let our audience know, Walker Hanlon is an associate professor in economics at Northwestern University. And today we will talk about directed technical change, whether necessity is the mother of innovations, why British Industrial Revolution persisted, how innovation networks were formed at the time, and why British Industrial Revolution triggered growth and the role of government. So many interesting topics, and it's going to be mostly related to economic history. But before we go into the research questions, maybe we can start with your personal interest. Like, for example, I wonder what made you interested in economic history, economics of innovation, and economic growth.
So I didn't start out being interested in economic history when I was a grad student. I it took a winding path to get there. I was initially interested in international trade, and Columbia, where I did my grad program, was a great place to do trade. But within trade, the thing that seemed the most interesting to me was the relationship between trade and growth, right? That's where it seemed like trade could have really big effects. And that got me interested in growth. And, I read sort of the classic growth papers, the Romer and Lucas stuff. And, I realized if I wanted to do something empirical related to growth, then, history is really maybe the best place to look, right? You sort of, if you want to look over the long run, if you want to look at sort of big changes in growth rates, then you need to look at history. And so that kind of led me down this history path. And I was just lucky that I had advisors who, even though they were sort of trade and development people, were very supportive of me going in a different direction as long as I could convince them that it was interesting.
Oh, I see. So was there like a specific paper or person who influenced you, to choose this path? I don't know, maybe there was a paper that made you think like, oh, maybe a combination between economic history and trade would be a better one. I don't know. Was there someone like that, or a project or something?
Well, one of my advisors was Don Davis, and I've always really liked his paper with David Weinstein on bones, bombs, and breakpoints, which is just I think, a fantastic use of a historical event to answer a question that is posed by economic theory, which I don't think could be answered in any other way. And so, that's a paper where I sort of saw how one could make this connection between using history to provide sort of this empirical evaluations of sort of existing economic theory, and in particular sort of big picture issues.
Is this a methodology of yours? You start with theories first and then think about how empirically you can provide evidence on that? Is this how, in general, you approach to a research question?
I think what I know from economics, and economic theory sort of gives me a set of questions that I think are interesting. I think of economic theory as giving me a set of questions that I'm interested in, sort of carrying around a bag of questions and looking at history and seeing, what history can help me say about the set of interesting questions. So that's sort of, I guess, somewhat how I think about my methodology.
I also want to ask, you are an expert, especially in British economic history. So you worked on, British Industrial Revolution. What made you specifically, work on that, era or that, time period or the revolution itself?
Yeah, I think one of the unusual things about me as a researcher, as an economist in particular, is that I tend to focus on one particular setting. So almost all of my work is about Britain during what we would call the long 19th century, from the Industrial Revolution up to the onset of the First World War. But within that setting, I study all sorts of different economic questions, from sort of environmental to demography and health and innovation. In part, I think that there's a lot of randomness in that. I got my job market idea. It happened to be about, what was going on in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. And I learned a lot about that context. And from there was some increasing returns. I think, in part, I was lucky in that learning about that context, I realized that there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of interesting questions about this sort of Britain during this period. And there's a good amount of data that I can bring to bear. And so sort of became a bit of increasing returns in terms of the data that I had available and my understanding of the historical context.
I see. At some point when you were a PhD student or, after your PhD, did you, come to the UK and try to collect data, or was it already kind of publicly available, or somehow you could just digitize them without even coming or going to the UK?
No, when I was a grad student, I spent 6 months in the UK a couple times because, at that point, it hadn't all been scanned. And so I was sitting in the British Library or the basement of the LSE library, photographing stuff. I used to, when I started as an assistant professor, I said I would go 2 weeks twice a year. Now, so many things are either already on my hard drive or have been photographed from the archives that sort of, unfortunately for me, I have fewer and fewer excuses to go for research to the UK, although I come regularly for talks.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you missed those times, but I remember some of my friends going to the British Library. They were kind of complaining about it, like, because, they spend the whole day there and then they have to scan all those kinds of things just like in the room with no window and stuff. But yeah, it pays off at the end. And also, I want to let our listeners know, in case they're interested in such databases, on your website, which I also used, there are several data sets publicly available, such as British City Industry Database from 1851 to 1911. There is also British Patent Classification Database from 1855 to 1882. And there is also a recent paper with Brian Beach, I think, about historical newspaper archives as it's a user guide. So if people are interested in those, historical databases, they can just immediately go to your website and take a look at those and download. I also wanted to share that with, with people. So since we're talking about, Britain itself and economic history and innovations, maybe let's start with a more kind of a general question, and then we can start talking about your paper titled Necessity is the Mother of Invention, Input Supplies and Directed Technical Change. So let's start with, what drives innovation? I mean, it looks like, some nations, or, at some point they, thrive in innovations, but some don't. So let's talk about this general question first, and then let's go into the, whether necessity is the mother of invention, or, what is directed technical change, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is sort of one of the very big questions in the bag that I carry around. Why do some countries seem to be more successful innovators than others? Why did we see this onset of innovation really in the 18th and 19th centuries, where we accelerated into modern economic growth, generating all the wonderful things that we enjoy today? These are big questions. They're sort of too big to tackle, I think, in a particular paper. And so you have to sort of start slicing them down and asking more precise, more specific questions. And the one branch of that is that directed technical change literature. I think another branch is this literature on institutions, which we associate with, particularly with Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And I think there are many other branches in this sort of big question that I think are all contributing to our understanding of this, what's got to be a very complex answer.
So then, what is directed technical change? Maybe we can start with that.
So when I think of directed technical change, I think of it in sort of the theoretical sense coming out of a series of Acemoglu papers about 20 years ago, where essentially they're thinking, he's thinking about when we have changes in the supply of inputs to the production process, how does that influence in a market economy the direction of innovation? Is innovation aimed at economizing on those inputs that become relatively more scarce, or instead is it aimed at taking advantage of those inputs which are now relatively more abundant? So it's about how the factors available for production, changes in those relative availability of factors, influences the direction of innovation. Acemoglu's theory, which I think is right, at least that's what my paper shows, basically says, look, it depends on how able we are to substitute these different inputs into the production process. If they're very substitutable, then why bother trying to economize on the scarce factor when we can just substitute in the more abundant factor and take advantage of that? And so, we want to innovate with that in mind. If it's very hard to substitute, then we need to really economize on this factors that are becoming relatively more scarce. I think that's basically right, and sort of tells us about how innovation is moving in response to these changes in the availability of these inputs.
So then what are the theories? Are there any different theories about abundance, scarcity versus, the direction of technical change? If, for example, labor is scarce, then there might be more labor saving technologies. I don't know, maybe that's one theory which says that if there is scarcity, there will always the direction of the technology is going to be in that direction. Maybe you can enlighten us if there is one saying if it's more abundant, then it's going to also affect the direction of technology. So
Well, I think the old thinking, before we had a real sort of, and it's a great example of how like a rigorous theory really helps us clarify our thinking, right? The old thinking, which goes back to Hicks and Habakkuk, was this idea that, we've observed that the US is this sort of labor scarce economy historically, right? It was always kind of labor scarce relative to Europe. Uh, and it had this real rapid innovation, particularly in the late 19th and into the 20th century, and the idea that those could be linked, that basically labor scarcity could be an important motivator for technological progress because there was a real need for labor saving machines. And that fits with the sort of the more modern version of directed technical change. If you think that it's hard to substitute labor for other inputs into the production process, then you may want to economize on labor. Although it doesn't necessarily tell you that the sort of the overall level of innovation will be higher or lower. It tells you, these theories are more about the direction of innovation.
When you think about scarcity, it looks like, because it is necessary, like it's a necessity to innovate, at that time. So is this what you mean in the paper? Can you tell us about that paper where you say, necessity is the mother of invention,
So this paper, which was my job market paper, basically uses this shock to the British economy caused by the US Civil War as an experiment, because this shock essentially, causes one of the key inputs to their production process, which is US cotton, to become much more scarce. And this is the biggest and most important industry in the UK at the time, and it's very reliant on US cotton, which is being grown in the South. And the Civil War is going to disrupt that flow for a variety of reasons. And, the question was how, in this essentially very laissez-faire free market system that existed in Britain at this time, how did these innovators respond to it? And, one option could have been that they economize on that US cotton. They develop new machines that sort of waste less cotton and things like that. An alternative is that they substitute towards other types of cotton. And that in this case is what they do, because those two types of cotton are relatively substitutable. And so as the model would predict, you would want to substitute towards technologies that allow you to take advantage of the inputs that are relatively more abundant in this case, because it's so easy to substitute. And and so that provides a clean test. And the most interesting test is what it does to relative prices, because that's kind of one of the surprising predictions of Acemoglu's theory, is that the relative price of the input, which becomes relatively more abundant, could actually go up because of all this technological progress. And that's essentially what I find, which I think was the most surprising result in the paper.
So where does Acemoglu kind of benchmark his theory on? Like, what is I don't know, is there a specific example that he works on? And then
I think the motivation for that line of work, at least in the period in which Acemoglu was doing it, was this observation in the US that you had a rising share of college educated workers, which we should have expected to push down the relative return to college, but the relative return to college seemed to be going up. And so that's a puzzling feature, right? But you could explain that if, in response to that rising availability of college educated workers, right, you had an increase in innovation that was skill biased. You have this change in the inputs into the production process and the relative abundance, you get skill biased technical change. And his model shows how that can actually lead the relative returns to these college educated workers to rise. What's interesting is you can take that theory, which was built on, sort of that very different context, but it's a very general idea, and you can take it to the context in my paper and still find support for sort of the predictions of the model.
And also, maybe a very naive question, but why do we care about the direction of innovation? So why is it important?
Well, I think there's lots of contexts where we care about, the direction of innovation. Probably the easiest one is to go back to the labor market example and think about, this abundance of college educated workers increasing, generating skill bias technical change, right? If that raises the relative returns to college educated workers, and it has big implications for things like inequality. It has implications for the incentives for the college educated share to increase even further, right? So that's a context where we really care about, the direction of innovation, not just the level. And, you can think of lots of other contexts, I think, but that's sort of one where it's very clear.
Right. When you think about the direction of technologies, since you also mentioned that, laissez-faire at the time, so you have a book which was published very recently. Congratulations, by the way. It's called The Laissez-Faire Experiment, Why Britain Embraced and Then Abandoned Small Government, 1800 to 1914. Let's talk about maybe the role of government and how it might have led or changed the direction of innovation. And then, you can also tell us about what this book is about and what it's telling us.
Yeah, so I mean, my interest in the book actually emerged from this papers like the job market paper that I just described, where one of the selling points of this context is that you have an environment where the government is doing just very limited intervention, much less than we would expect a government to intervene today in sort of a similar type of shock. And that provides a really nice experimental context for thinking about how the market responds without a lot of government intervention. And that got me thinking about why did they have this government, sort of this laissez-faire government system, and why did they eventually move away from it? And that's what the book ultimately is trying to answer, is particularly the second of those questions, sort of why, having experienced this laissez-faire system, they ultimately gave up on it.
Was there a specific failure? Can you give us a bit more hints about why there was that change?
I mean, the basic theory, the basic argument in the book is that there were a series of governments that really generally did believe in laissez-faire. They thought of laissez-faire as sort of like the default approach to government. But as the economy grew in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the second half of the 19th century, as it became more urbanized, more interconnected through international trade, technology was increasing and becoming more complex, human capital was becoming more important. All of these forces create a series of market failures, which are the types of market failures that we're familiar with as economists. Externalities like pollution, information asymmetries causing markets to be inefficient. This accumulation of market failures causes the governments to sort of pragmatically, step by step, increase their intervention in the market. And they get pulled further and further into intervening to the point where by 1910 or so, they've essentially given up on laissez-faire because they've intervened in so many different ways to deal with so many different small problems that they've seen, that they basically laid the foundation for most of the things that modern governments do.
All right. So then there is a huge link between the market failures and the government role. And sometimes, since you also mentioned pollution, and you also have a paper related to pollution, at that time, I sometimes, think of myself when I'm in London or, walking on the streets, and it's just like, how it would feel like, to be in that era and with that pollution. I just can't imagine. So, it was probably a huge problem at the time.
It was enormous. I think it was, we don't have precise measurements of the level of pollution, but in the 19th century, the big industrial cities in the UK plus London had pollution levels that were probably as bad as any developing city in the past 20 years. So, you can think of Beijing 20 years ago on its worst day, or Delhi. It was really, really bad to the point where actually even just as a visibility issue, it became challenging to get around the city, and they didn't have a full understanding of the health consequences of these things, of all this pollution that they were breathing in, right? And so one of the things my papers do is go back and try to measure how large that was.
How do you measure pollution at that time?
So you have to infer it. You don't have direct measures. And so I have, different papers where I do it in different ways. So I have this recent paper in Restat called the London Fog, where I'm looking at basically acute exposure generated by weather events that are associated with fog, but they're basically trapping the pollution in. So they're essentially like temperature inversions, and that's trapping the pollution in London. And so, even though I can't see until the sort of the 20th century part of that paper, how the actual levels of pollution are changing, I can use that variation in the intensity of this exposure to get an idea of how much of the mortality pattern that we see is being driven by acute exposure to high levels of air pollution.
So yeah, I mean, I think you're a data digger because I mean, you collect so many really nice data. And we had an episode with Robin Burgess like a few episodes ago, and we were talking about how environmental economics, especially, is kind of very innovative, especially in terms of like coming up with that data and trying to capture pollution or finding different methodologies. And I think you're also amazing in that. When we think about innovation itself, the government might have a role and the market plays a role there, but at the same time, you have papers about why in British Industrial Revolution persisted. For example, in your paper titled "The Rise of the Engineer: Inventing the Professional Inventor During the Industrial Revolution," you, for example, cite Joel Mokyr saying that there were innovation waves throughout history, but they were mostly temporary. I mean, it looks like they were temporary. And this one was permanent specifically. So why this one specifically persisted? How do you explain that?
I mean, we know that, innovation wasn't new when the Industrial Revolution began, but we also know that the Industrial Revolution is the only time that humanity has experienced this rapid acceleration and achieved modern economic growth, right? Which looks completely different than anything that we've seen before, right? So this was something that was new. I don't think we understand entirely either what happened or why, or how the system changed. But my paper on the rise of the engineers is trying to look at one aspect of that change, and specifically at the innovation system. And the origin of this paper was just that if you look at the type of people that are generating new innovations in the UK across the Industrial Revolution, there's this huge change. It goes from people who are mostly sort of manufacturer inventors, right? They're mainly, they have a factory, they do something in their factory, they occasionally produce an innovation related typically to the thing that they do, right? To a system in which the largest group of inventors are engineers who define their profession as, inventors and designers, right? Not manufacturers of cotton textiles or rubber pipes or something, but generalist designers. And so when I saw that pattern, I thought, that seems like a really fundamental and important change in who is generating these innovations across this Industrial Revolution period. And it made me think of Adam Smith's ideas about how, in the pin factory, specialization increases productivity, right? Now, what if that specialization is applied to the process of generating new innovations, right? So we start to have specialist inventors who are more productive at generating new innovations. Well, I have a simple model in the paper that shows that that's going to accelerate the rate of technological progress. And I think that's essentially the story of what happened during this period, part of the story, which is that innovation starts to become something that people do as a profession that they specialize in, that allows them to be more productive, right? And because they're more productive in innovation, that has big consequences for growth.
So then we're not just talking about a title change, like from being manufacturer inventor to an engineer, but we're talking about a new kind of a social class, or I don't know, another group or economic group emerging at the time?
That's the argument. I mean, the hard part is always separating this idea, right? That, maybe we just start calling ourselves something different, and I just don't think that that's what's going on. In the paper, I try to convince the reader that that's not what's going on by showing the reader that, these engineers just look very different than other types of inventors. They're more productive, they produce higher quality inventions. And you can even see it within an individual's career, that once they start describing themselves as an engineer, they start to look different and they start to act different and they start to be more productive. And so, I think that suggests that this is not just a changing of occupational titles, but that, occupations actually, these titles actually carry content. They tell us about what people are doing, right? And what people are doing, and how they do it matters for, what they produce and how good they are at producing it.
I think you touch upon really interesting theories. One thing that I also want to ask you is, like, how did you think about engineers? Like how did you come up with that idea? Where did you notice that, this looks like a new thing and then I should work on this? Like, how did you find that?
So, I mean, this was really driven by this pattern in the patent data, which, essentially I gathered this patent data with occupational titles. And there's just one extremely striking feature of this data, which is that there are no engineers early in the period before the Industrial Revolution. The engineers start emerging during the Industrial Revolution, and then they come to dominate the innovation system. And then there was this question of, is this just a relabeling, or are these people doing the kind of work that they're doing? Is it sort of, are they doing it in a fundamentally different way? And I eventually became convinced that they're doing it in a fundamentally different way, in that they are becoming specialists at this activity where the core specialization is invention and design, which includes both sort of design of civil engineering projects and invention of, typically mechanical engineering machines, and that made them just fundamentally different than the type of people who were doing most innovation before.
I'm thinking about the network among these engineers. Are we talking about like a spatial concentration? Like, for example, in London, we observe that class emerging, especially, and being more dominant.
I don't think that it's any more concentrated in London than other types of economic activities at this time. So there's definitely some important engineers who really got their career going in London, but there's lots of other important engineers who started working out in the provinces on different types of projects. So, I don't think it was a London thing. I do think that, information flow mattered. They were learning about each other. They were following examples and sort of seeing, particularly with James Watt and his success, sort of seeing this example of how successful you could be if you went down this career path. And I think if I want to draw analogies, I think, you can think of like the early computer pioneers and how, this huge success that some of them had pulled all these other people into this sort of digital entrepreneurship type activities. I think that's part of what was going on here.
So then can we also say that, for example, a complementary cultural shift accompanying this technological change made maybe this industrial revolution more permanent? Like, I don't know, I'm trying to kind of maybe reach out to a more general kind of a conclusion with like, this is also a cultural change, because there were, say, no engineers, or, there was no such a systematic change before. And it looks like it's changing this, society itself, and maybe becoming more permanent because there are now occupations and the culture is changing a bit. Or maybe even the institutions, I don't know, they're all embedded into each other.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, maybe it's a bit of a cultural change. I don't typically think of it that way. And I don't think of it as an institutional change. I mean, one of the really striking features is that the government played basically zero role in this profession during the first sort of century. I think what's going on here is that the market is expanding, and endogenously this generates space for specialization, right? Basically, again, going back to Smith, right? You have the size of the market allows specialization, and it just happens that this kind of specialization is particularly important because it makes people more productive at the sort of the activity that most generates economic growth. And so I think it's this is an endogenous mechanism operating within these changes that are going on during the Industrial Revolution that's essentially magnifying the effect of these initial changes. That's how I think about it, rather than as a cultural change. But I would say that the culture and the institutions had to be right for this to happen.
But how do you think, like, over time, when you think about today, do you observe the same things that you observe at the time today as well? Like, or would you have new theories about the direction of technology or production of technology and specialization?
No, I think this is one of the first steps in a process that continues today. And there's evidence that, today people are becoming even more specialized. Inventors are becoming even more specialized, which is a response to the fact that there's enough market to support that specialization, and that specialization is required because the technologies are becoming so complex. And I think of this as sort of like the first step in that direction, because it's the first time that people start to specialize in invention at all, not even within a a little teeny slice of invention, but just, becoming somebody whose primary occupational sort of defining characteristic is that they do invention and design work rather than running a factory. So I think of this as the first step on a process that the evidence shows continues to today. And I think that specialization, right, is one of the things that's pushing against the fact that, as technology becomes more complex, it seems to be more and more challenging to develop the next great idea.
I see. And so maybe we can, talk about a few things about your research, and then we can switch to some of the cheesy or personal questions that I prepared in this or that game. So what are you currently working on? And you also mentioned the research bag or the bag of questions that you have. So maybe can you tell us about the gaps in the literature and maybe, help us find questions and work on them?
I mean, economic history is sort of littered with big questions that we don't know the answer to. I think, the biggest in sort of my slice are related to the Industrial Revolution, the demographic transition, and the role of the state and the development of states. I'm particularly interested in the first two of those. One of the main ongoing projects I have right now is a paper with Lucas Rosenberger and Carl Hallman, where we basically started from the observation, this is again looking at the Industrial Revolution, that, British inventors were quite innovative during this period, but so were continental inventors, but they seem to be doing different sorts of things. And in that paper, we draw on some modern growth literature that essentially embeds innovation networks within an endogenous growth theory. Right? So these are networks where, the nodes are like types of technologies, and the edges, the spillovers are the idea that if I invent a particular type of technology, maybe it helps me invent another technology of a different type. It's really about how innovating in, say, technology A generates spillovers that may be useful for technology B. So it's important to clarify, it's not about sort of who you know, but about what type of innovations are being generated and the consequences they have for innovations in other areas, right? So, there's these modern theories that suggest that, if you have these innovation networks where a country's innovators are spread across the nodes, so what types of technologies they're inventing, right, has implications for the rate of technological progress. And we take that idea back to the Industrial Revolution. We introduce some new methods for basically, implementing these kind of ideas in a less data-rich environment. And we show that Britain benefited from having inventors who were really central in the innovation system at this time. So they were doing mechanical technologies like steam engines, which were generating lots of spillovers, whereas the continental inventors were very innovative, but they were out at the periphery doing things like paper making or glass that just generated a lot fewer spillovers. And so, I think this is another paper that's trying to chip away at one of the big questions in my field, which is, what happened during the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, why was it British?
Oh, I see. All right. So, I mean, you have really amazing research, and hope our also listeners enjoyed the research part. And I also want to ask you several questions. Like, for example, if you couldn't be an economist or like economic historian, what would you be in a parallel universe?
It's a good question. I don't
You
know.
never thought about it?
I don't know. I would say that I was very close to ending up as a military officer. So that's probably my parallel universe outcome.
Oh, interesting. Actually, I think I don't know, when thinking about military and then innovations, there is also a huge link there.
Well, I have a bit of stuff on military aircraft, but I literally flipped a coin that I think put me on this path rather than that path. So we can chalk that up as a true experiment.
So if you could, I mean, since you work on economic history a lot, so if you could travel, if you could time travel, would you prefer to go back to, I don't know, a specific time, in history, or would you prefer to go to, somewhere like sometime in the future?
I mean, I think, given what I study, I would, of course, want to go back to sort of the middle of the 19th century UK and try to see how much I truly understand this setting, because I spent a lot of time reading and trying to understand, trying to really get a feel for the setting, which I think is, fundamental for an economic historian. But I'm sure that there are still so many aspects of it that I'm failing to grasp, that I don't really understand. And so I would love to, go back and sort of see how close am I, and what are the big things I'm getting wrong.
Oh, I see. Well, I also asked ChatGPT and said, what kind of a fun question would you ask Walker Hanlon? And it was asking this actually: if you could time travel back to the Industrial Revolution, what job would you have? Would you be an inventor, a factory owner, or the guy writing angry pamphlets about pollution?
I mean, I think I would be, I have no hesitation on that one. I would be an engineer. I think that, the engineers that I study, like they're just doing such exciting work at such an exciting time. Like they're really laying the foundation for the profession that still drives, a lot of the innovation that we have today forward. So what an exciting time to be sort of at the early stages of this engineering profession in the UK. That's what I would do for sure.
I sometimes ask people about their failures and what they learned from their failures. Is there anything like any kind of a failure that you remember from your academic career where you think like, I'm not going to do this again, or I learned a lot from this and I just advise people, I don't know, to do it or not to do it? Or is there anything like that?
The first thing that comes to mind is I think it took me a long time to realize that as an academic, I'm a bit of an optimist. And I think academic optimists need to co-author with academic pessimists. Because we write papers, the optimists like me, and you think it's like the greatest thing ever and you love it and you send it out. And, you need a pessimist there sitting next to you telling you that it's terrible and that, it needs to be so much better to sort of find that balance. And so I have to try to be my own pessimist, but I'm not necessarily very good at it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, but I think it makes sense. Just you complement each other, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so maybe let's play this game, this or that. I didn't give you the names. So last time I was asking Sasha Becker to write a book. And this time I'm asking you, you're going to go out for a history-themed dinner with a guest of your choosing. Okay, so you're just going to, I don't know, talk about a time period that you want to talk about. And you can only pick one. So you're going to go to that dinner with the one that you choose at the end. So you're left with, at the end. So who would you choose? James Watt or Nikola Tesla?
Oh, definitely Watt.
Right. After all this talk, I think, yeah.
Yeah, very clear.
Yeah, James Watt or Petra Moser?
Well, I've had many great dinners with Petra Moser, so I would have to say Watt only for that reason.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and you were with her, I think, at the NYU because you worked at the NYU, and then I know you're very close with her. And also, okay, so James Watt or Erudite?
I'd probably still go with Watt. Watt, what I think would be unconstrained at the top of my list or near.
Oh, really? Okay, so all the other options are going to go.
So your other options probably not going to generate a lot of variation.
Okay, I was going to say Brian Beach. How would that work?
Well, I have also had many wonderful dinners with Brian.
Okay. All right, so James Watt or Adam Smith?
So now that's a tough one. I think I would probably have to go with Adam Smith in that case. But
Adam Smith or Joel Mokyr?
Well, Joel is right down the hall here, and so I've also had many wonderful dinners with him, and so Smith would win out.
Okay, yeah. So those were the people that I had. So you're going out, to a dinner with Adam Smith, and it's great. So thank you very much, Walker. It was great to talk to you. And I hope our listeners also enjoyed the talk. So if they have any comments, any questions, they can email us at lscpodcast@gmail.com, or they can tweet us at poid_cast on Twitter. See you in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.